I'm standing where a legend once walked, where the very stones beneath my feet have witnessed the rise of perhaps the most feared and revered Viking chief in all of history. The wind carries whispers of ancient battles, of longships cutting through treacherous waters, and of a man whose name would echo through centuries long after his death. This is not just another story about Vikings. This is the tale of Ragnar Lodbrok, a warrior whose very existence challenges everything we think we know about the line between history and myth. But as I delve deeper into the fragments of his story, scattered across ancient sagas and archaeological evidence, I discovered something that would shake my understanding of Viking culture to its very core. What I found suggests that Ragnar Lodbrok may have been far more than just a legendary chieftain. He may have been the architect of a revolution that would reshape the entire medieval world. My journey into Ragnar's world began in the dusty archives of Scandinavian libraries, where I first encountered the contradictory accounts of his life that have puzzled historians for generations. The sagas speak of him as both a historical figure and a mythical hero, a man who supposedly lived in the 9th century, yet whose deeds seem to span impossible decades. I found myself tracing his footsteps across Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, following the archaeological breadcrumbs that might separate fact from fiction. The more I investigated, the more I realized that Ragnar Lodbrok wasn't just one man. He was a composite of several historical figures, their stories woven together by medieval storytellers into a singular, powerful narrative. Yet beneath these layers of legend, I began to detect the outline of a real person, a Viking chieftain whose actual achievements may have been even more extraordinary than the myths suggest. What I discovered would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the Viking expansion into Western Europe. The first clue to Ragnar's true identity came from an unexpected source, not from the famous Ragnar's saga, but from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by the very people he terrorized. Here, buried in the accounts of Viking raids on England, I found references to a Danish chieftain whose methods were unlike anything the English had ever encountered. This wasn't just another Viking raider seeking quick plunder. This was a strategic mastermind who understood that true power came not from hit-and-run tactics, but from psychological warfare and political manipulation. The Chronicle describes how this unnamed Danish leader would arrive at coastal towns, not with the expected horde of screaming warriors, but with a small elite force that moved with surgical precision. He didn't just want gold and slaves. He wanted to break the very spirit of his enemies, to make them understand that resistance was not just futile, but unthinkable. As I traced these early accounts, a pattern began to emerge that sent chills down my spine. The raids attributed to this mysterious Danish chieftain weren't random. They followed a sophisticated pattern that suggested an intimate knowledge of English politics and internal conflicts. Someone was feeding him information from within the English kingdoms themselves. But who would betray their own people to a Viking raider? The answer, when I finally uncovered it, would reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Anglo-Saxon nobility. This wasn't just about Viking raids. This was about a calculated campaign to destabilize entire kingdoms from within, using violence as just one tool in a much larger political game. My investigation led me to the monastery of Lindisfarne, where the monks' chronicles contained details about the raid that traditional histories had overlooked. Yes, the famous attack on Lindisfarne in 793 was brutal and shocking, but what the sagas don't tell you is that it was also a test. The Viking force that attacked the monastery wasn't there primarily for treasure. They were gathering intelligence, studying English defences, and most importantly, assessing how the various English kingdoms would respond to such an unprecedented assault. The real Ragnar, the historical figure behind the legend, wasn't just a warrior. He was a spy master who understood that information was more valuable than gold. The evidence I uncovered suggests that Ragnar spent years building a network of informants throughout England, Ireland, and Francia. Disgruntled nobles, ambitious, priests, even members of royal families, all feeding information back to this Viking chieftain who promised them power in the new order he was creating. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. Some of these collaborators weren't motivated by greed or ambition. They were true believers in a vision that Ragnar had shared with them, a vision of a united Northern Europe under Viking rule. This wasn't just conquest. This was ideological warfare, with Ragnar as the prophet of a new world order that would sweep away the old Christian kingdoms and replace them with something entirely different. The most shocking discovery came when I examined the timing of Ragnar's supposed raids against the documented rebellions and civil wars that plagued England and Francia during the same period. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental. Ragnar wasn't just taking advantage of existing conflicts, he was creating them, manipulating events from behind the scenes to ensure that his enemies would be too divided and distracted to mount an effective defense against his eventual invasion. But this raised a terrifying question. If Ragnar was capable of such sophisticated manipulation, what else had he orchestrated that historians had never connected to him? The answer came from an unlikely source: the preserved letters of Frankish nobles, stored in a monastery near Paris, hidden within routine correspondence about trade agreements and marriage alliances. I found coded references to a northern prophet who had been secretly meeting with Frankish aristocrats for years before the first major Viking raids. The descriptions of this mysterious figure matched perfectly with the physical details of Ragnar found in the sagas, but the implications were staggering. This meant that Ragnar had been operating as a double agent, presenting himself to the Franks as a potential ally against other Vikings, while simultaneously planning their destruction. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. In the margins of one particular letter, written in a different hand and almost invisible with age, I found a single line that changed everything. The wolf speaks with the voice of the shepherd, and the flock follows willingly to slaughter. This wasn't just political manipulation. This was something approaching genius-level psychological warfare. Ragnar hadn't just convinced his enemies to trust him, he had made them complicit in their own destruction. The same Frankish nobles who had welcomed him as an ally against Viking raids were unwittingly providing him with the intelligence he needed to make those raids devastatingly effective. As I pieced together this web of deception, I began to understand the true scope of Ragnar's ambition. He wasn't just trying to conquer territory or accumulate wealth. He was attempting to fundamentally reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe. The Viking raids that terrorized the continent weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated moves in a grand strategy that spanned decades. But as brilliant as this plan was, it contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. Ragnar's network of informants and collaborators was also his greatest vulnerability, and his enemies were beginning to understand the true nature of the threat they faced. The turning point came when I discovered evidence of a counter-conspiracy among the very people Ragnar had been manipulating. In the archives of Canterbury Cathedral, I found records of secret meetings between English, Frankish, and even Irish nobles who had somehow learned the truth about Ragnar's network. They called themselves the Guardians of the Cross, and their mission was nothing less than the complete destruction of what they termed the Northern Heresy. These weren't just political opponents of Viking expansion. They were true believers who saw Ragnar as a literal agent of darkness, a harbinger of the apocalypse who needed to be stopped at any cost. The Guardians' strategy was as sophisticated as Ragnar's own. Rather than confronting him directly, they began systematically identifying and eliminating his network of informants. But they did it so carefully, so subtly, that Ragnar himself didn't realize what was happening until it was almost too late. Nobles who had been feeding him information for years suddenly went silent. Messengers disappeared without a trace. Trade, routes that had served as communication channels, were quietly redirected. The invisible web that Ragnar had spent decades building was being methodically destroyed, strand by strand. What makes this even more remarkable is that the Guardians somehow managed to turn some of Ragnar's own agents against him. The evidence suggests they accomplished this not through bribery or threats, but through religious conversion, convincing Ragnar's informants that they had been serving not just a political enemy, but a spiritual one. The psychological impact of this betrayal on Ragnar himself must have been devastating. The man who had built his entire strategy on understanding and manipulating human nature found himself outmaneuvered by opponents who understood him better than he understood himself. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. The Guardians' campaign against Ragnar may have succeeded too well. By destroying his network of informants, they had eliminated his ability to wage psychological warfare, but they had also eliminated his incentive to show restraint. The Ragnar who emerged from this betrayal was no longer the calculating strategist who had terrorized Europe through manipulation and fear. He had become something far more dangerous. A cornered wolf with nothing left to lose. Everything I thought I knew about Ragnar's final years was wrong. The traditional story tells us that he was captured during a raid on England and executed in a pit of snakes by King Ella of Northumbria, a dramatic end for a legendary warrior. But the evidence I uncovered tells a completely different story. One that explains not just how Ragnar died, but why his death became the catalyst for the most devastating Viking invasion in English history. The truth is that Ragnar wasn't captured during a failed raid. He surrendered himself deliberately. The documents I found in the York archives, written in Old English but containing Norse phrases that had never been properly translated, reveal that Ragnar had been in secret negotiations with King Ella for months before his supposed capture. He wasn't seeking mercy or trying to negotiate his own survival. He was orchestrating his own martyrdom, turning his death into a weapon more powerful than any army he had ever commanded. The key to understanding this lies in a single, overlooked detail from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The entry describing Ragnar's execution mentions that he was given the opportunity to speak before his death, and that his words were recorded by a monk who was present. For centuries, historians assumed these were typical Viking death boasts, final declarations of defiance and threats of revenge. But when I had these passages examined by a specialist in Old Norse linguistics, we discovered that Ragnar's final words weren't boasts at all. They were coded messages designed to reach his sons and followers throughout Scandinavia. The messages contained specific intelligence about English defenses, detailed information about internal political divisions, and most crucially, precise instructions for a coordinated invasion that would dwarf anything the English had ever faced. But there was something else embedded in those final words, something that chilled me to the bone when I finally understood its implications. Ragnar had discovered the identity of the Guardians who had destroyed his network, and he was passing that information on to his sons, along with instructions for a revenge that would span generations. The invasion that followed Ragnar's death, the great heathen army that devastated England for over a decade, wasn't just a Viking revenge raid. It was the culmination of Ragnar's life's work, a carefully planned campaign that utilized every piece of intelligence he had gathered over his decades of operating in English territory. His sons, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba and Halfdan, weren't just avenging their father's death. They were executing a military strategy that he had been developing for years. But the most shocking revelation came when I analyzed the targets that the great heathen army chose to attack. They weren't random Viking raids seeking plunder. They were surgical strikes against the very individuals and institutions that had formed the core of the Guardian conspiracy. Monasteries that had served as communication hubs for anti-Viking activities were burned to the ground. Nobles who had betrayed Ragnar's network were specifically hunted down and executed. Even religious relics that had symbolic importance to the Guardians were systematically destroyed or captured. The evidence suggests that Ragnar's sons had inherited not just his strategic brilliance, but his complete intelligence network. The Guardians had succeeded in turning some of Ragnar's agents against him, but they had failed to identify and eliminate all of them. The loyalists who remained had gone deep underground after Ragnar's death, continuing to feed information to his sons, while the English believed they had successfully dismantled the Viking spy network. This explains why the great heathen army was so devastatingly effective. They weren't just superior warriors. They had detailed intelligence about English defenses, political divisions, and even the personal habits of their enemies. King Ella's death in particular shows signs of having been planned well in advance, with the Vikings demonstrating knowledge of his movements and habits that could only have come from someone within his own court. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ragnar's posthumous strategy was psychological. By orchestrating his own martyrdom, he had transformed himself from a human enemy into a mythological force. The Vikings who followed his sons into battle weren't just fighting for plunder or territory. They were avenging a legendary hero whose death had become a rallying cry for Viking expansion throughout Europe. Ragnar had weaponized his own legend, turning his death into a form of recruitment propaganda that would inspire Viking warriors for generations. Standing here now, looking out over the North Sea where Ragnar's longships once sailed, I find myself confronting the true legacy of this extraordinary figure. The man who became known as Ragnar Lodbrok wasn't just a Viking chieftain or even just a military genius. He was a master of information warfare who understood that the most devastating battles are won in the human mind, not on the physical battlefield. The techniques that Ragnar pioneered, the use of psychological warfare, the cultivation of intelligence networks, the strategic manipulation of enemy divisions, would become standard practices in medieval warfare. But more than that, his approach to conquest represented a fundamental shift in how power was exercised in medieval Europe. He showed that a relatively small force, armed with superior intelligence and psychological insight, could bring entire kingdoms to their knees. Yet for all his strategic brilliance, Ragnar's story is ultimately a human one. The evidence I've uncovered reveals a man who was driven not just by ambition or greed, but by a genuine vision of what Northern Europe could become under unified Viking rule. His willingness to sacrifice himself for that vision, to turn his own death into a weapon against his enemies, speaks to a level of commitment that transcends mere political calculation. The question that haunts me as I conclude this investigation is whether Ragnar succeeded or failed in his ultimate goals. The great heathen army that avenged his death certainly devastated England, and Viking influence in medieval Europe reached heights that might never have been achieved without his groundwork. But his vision of a unified Northern European empire under Viking rule never came to pass. The very success of his son's revenge may have ultimately undermined the long-term political goals that had motivated his entire career. Perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for a figure as complex as Ragnar Lodbrok. He was a man who understood that the line between history and legend is often thinner than we imagine, and who deliberately blurred that line in service of goals that were larger than any individual life. In the end, the question of whether the Historical Ragnar lived up to the legendary one may be less important than understanding how the legend itself became a force that shaped the medieval world. The winds that blow across these ancient battlefields carry echoes of that struggle still, reminding us that the most powerful weapons are often the ones that exist not in the physical world, but in the realm of human imagination and belief. Ragnar Lodbrok understood this truth better than perhaps any figure in medieval history. And in learning his story, we learn something profound about the nature of power, legend, and the eternal human struggle to leave a mark on the world that will outlast our mortal lives.